anyone who's listening now, the Q&A is where you ask questions. So welcome everyone to the National Association for Women in Construction's first online ABC Radio National gig. Today we will be talking about finishing the unfinished business, abolishing gender bias from the Australian construction industry. And this is to celebrate 25 years of the National Association's existence. We have Paul Barclay, who will be moderating today from ABC Radio National. Paul is a Wakely award-winning journalist and broadcaster, and we're very fortunate to have him. And before we begin, I'd just like to do acknowledgement to country. I'd like to begin by acknowledging the traditional owners of the land on which we meet today. I would also like to pay respects to elders past and present and extend that respect to all First Nations people present today. So thank you very much, everyone. And over to you, Paul.
Thanks very much, Marianne. It's great to be here. As Marianne said, I'm Paul Barclay, the host of Big Ideas on Radio National, for which this discussion is being recorded. So you'll be able to listen to it on the radio in the weeks to come. The Australian construction industry is dominated by men. I'm not telling you anything you don't know when I say this. After mining, it's the second most male-dominated industry, and its culture tends to reflect this. There's an adversarial relationship between bosses and workers. There's sexism and other unacceptable behaviours. And there's discrimination against women in the workplace, all of which exists outside of the construction sector too, I should say. The gender pay gap in the industry is large. So how do we go about changing this? How do we abolish gender bias in the construction industry? We need to, because we need to make use of the 50% of the population that can help us deal with the skills shortage that exists in this sector. We need more people, basically, trained and skilled people to deliver the infrastructure, and women are a vastly underutilised resource. That's what we're here to discuss today. I'm no expert on this, but I'm very fortunate to be joined by four people who are. Christine Schull is the National Chair of the National Association for Women in Construction and Executive Branch Manager, Legal Contracts and Procurement at Transport Canberra. Andre Noonan is the Chief Operating Officer at Athiona Australia and New Zealand, a large infrastructure company involved in renewable energy projects around the world. Paula Gerber is Professor of Law at the Faculty of Law at Monash University, and Dr. Nikki Vincent is Victoria's first Public Sector Gender Equity Commissioner, a fairly recently established position. And it's great to have all of you with us on Zoom. For the online Zoom audience, you can participate in this conversation by asking questions. Just type them into the chat box. We'll save some time for questions at the end, but we may even have time to come to your questions throughout the discussion as well. So don't hold back, put them in the box, and they'll pop up and I'll be able to see them and put them to our guests. Christine, I'll come to you first of all. How much gender discrimination and sexism occurs within the construction industry from your experience, and what form does this take?
Thank you, Paul, and good morning, everyone. I think from my experience alone, what I have witnessed, and as well as in my role within Nawic, the anecdotal evidence is still quite high. So whenever we think about gender discrimination, there are a variety of ways in which it manifests itself. And I think when I look at our industry, and don't get me wrong, I love working in this industry, I always have. I fell into it, and I have been what I call lucky, because I've been in a position where, a very, very privileged position, where I've had employers who've always supported my goals. But the reason I joined Nawic was because I was hearing that wasn't the same experience for a lot of women, and that experience was because women were in the minority. So I didn't know what the stats were when I first joined Nawic, but as of now, the percentage of women who are in the industry fall anywhere between 12 and 18%. So the data depends on where you draw it from and what is considered to be construction work. But that's not a very, very large number. Well, then when you look at women in trades, it's only 2%. Whenever you look at how many of those women are surrounded by men and what positions they're in, the discrimination often, I hasten to say, often it is not something that's conscious. A lot of it is unconscious. But the issue is, and anecdotally what we're seeing and what I'm hearing is that where it is still conscious is what disturbs me the most in 2021. So then some of the most recent examples are what I call some of the most basic human rights and basic functions of providing facilities for women on site, providing women with toilets or showers that lock. Sounds really, really simple. But it's things like that where if women do not feel safe coming to work or do not feel safe on site, they're going to stay away in droves. So in terms of how it's experienced, look, the gender pay gap as well. I mean, for me, that is just unconscionable in 2021, where the national gender pay gap is hovering between 14.5%. But for construction, it's 26.1. So that's quite a bit of a difference. And the gender pay gap, if you look at the WGEA stats, is calculated on a variety of different ways. But essentially, it boils down to not enough women in the leadership positions, women in more part-time or casual roles, and don't also get to receive the benefits that men who have been established in those roles receive, so in terms of bonuses and that sort of thing.
Yeah. So you've also had experience in the legal profession, I understand. How would you compare the two industries? Because I know a little bit about the legal profession as well, and women there complain about discrimination.
Yes, it's extraordinary. When you look at the stats of women entering into law school, and there tend to be more women who start studying law, but by the end, that number drops off, or those numbers who enter into the profession drop off considerably. And again, it's a very, very competitive industry. As I said, I fell into construction because where I was at the time, no one else was doing it. But I found very, very quickly that when I started entering into the construction law area, and Paula will probably agree that you were often the very only woman in the room when it came to either whether or not it was in court or whether or not it was in meetings or negotiations. And that really was, for me, quite extraordinary because coming from Canberra, in Canberra for the first time, I think we have more women in law than men. And it's the first time it's happened. So again, quite an extraordinary position in 2021, but going through and working within construction companies and on site, I was often the only woman in the room, in a boardroom, in a meeting. And it was, again, I think I have been quite lucky and quite privileged that I've never found that to be a barrier, but it's important for those who don't think it's a barrier to stop and look around and work out why it is for others. And I think, the legal industry is, yes, notoriously blokey. That is changing, and we can feel that change. I'm not feeling that change happen fast enough in the construction industry.
Yeah. So, Paula, you've had significant experience of this issue. Going back 25 years or so, you were the first president of the National Association for Women in Construction. So perhaps you can tell me, what was it like for women in the industry back then, and what, if anything, has changed in the past 25 years?
Thank you, Paul. I'd like to start by saying that I practiced as a construction lawyer in California, in Los Angeles, for 5 years, and I was in an all-male law firm. It was a boutique construction law firm, and I was the first female that ever employed. And I stumbled across Nawic, as I still call it, over there, and it was just a breath of fresh air to meet all these women who were working in construction, and they weren't clerical or human resources. They were women who are owning their businesses. And the reason why they were so successful is that California government had a policy that on any government project, 10% of the subcontractors or suppliers had to be either WBEs or MBEs, so women business enterprise or minority business enterprise. And that started, and it just gave all these women and minorities a chance to get into what historically has been a very white, blokey industry. And I came back to Australia in 1995, and it was like I'd gone back to the 1950s. There was just not this female presence in the construction industry. So I was actually working as a construction lawyer at King and Wood Mallisons, and I started contacting women in construction. And as my secretary said, do you really need to call every woman who's ever picked up a hammer? But I was trying to find every female who was working in the construction industry. And I put out this idea of what about an organisation like Nawic? And it just took off like wildfire. And I've always said the success, I'll know it's been successful when the organisation's not needed anymore. It really saddens me that 25 years later, Nawic is needed more than ever. And one of the things that's changed, I think, is, well, one of the positive things that changes, I think we're having more conversations like this about the problem and the need to come up with a solution. But one of the things that changes, I think there's less support from the government now than there was when I set Nawic up. The federal government were throwing money at Nawic when it started. We got $100,000 to produce a video about careers for women that was sent to every secondary school in Australia. We got more money from the Department of Science, Industry and Technology, as it then was, to get this organisation up and running. And I'm not seeing that level of support now to really change things.
I mean, we are talking more about STEM and more people studying STEM subjects such as engineering, for example, and more women should be studying those subjects. I mean, you hear some talk of that, but what you're saying is that that's not translating into a concerted effort to get more women into this particularly male-dominated industry.
When Nawic was set up, it had two aims. One was to attract women in, and so that's what you're talking about, getting women into the STEM courses. But the other one was to keep them. Yeah. The attrition rate for women in construction is ridiculous. For decades, more than 50% of the students in architecture are women. If you look at senior positions in architectural firms, the women just aren't there. So we have to address attrition as much as attracting women into the industry. And until we change the culture, women are not going to want to stay.
Nikki, I'm assuming you've heard stories like this throughout your career in gender equity. I know your role at the moment as Gender Equity Commissioner in Victoria only covers the public sector, but how does gender equity in the construction sector compare with the workplace overall? I mean, the workplace overall has a gender pay gap. The workplace overall has discrimination and sexism. How do you compare?
Look, the public sector, 68% women, but they're concentrated in lower paid roles. Pay gap is less than the private sector at 10.7, but it's still a substantial pay gap. And, you know, I mean, the premise of the Gender Equality Act and its coverage of the public sector, not just as we think of it, the public service, but all public sector bodies, including all of the 9 universities in Victoria and all of local government. So there are 79 councils that are covered by the Act as well. So 300 organisations, 300 plus organisations, 380,000 workers, around 11% of Victoria's workforce. So not an insubstantial group of organisations covered by the Act. The issues are there still in the public sector, and yet the public sector should be leading the change. So that's what the Act kind of aims to achieve, and it really is about addressing the composition of the workforce at all levels, the composition in governing bodies, workplace sexual harassment, which still happens across the public sector, the recruitment and promotion practices that are unconsciously biased, gendered segregation within the workforce. So women, what the jobs that women are likely to be doing compared to the jobs that men are likely to be doing, and including at sort of leadership levels. And then things like leave and flexibility, access to family and domestic violence leave, flexible working arrangements, the sorts of things that are all major issues within the construction sector. And then gender pay equity being another indicator. So this Act is about driving change in the public sector that then provides an example for the private sector. Although a lot of private sector organisations are doing this well, construction isn't, as we know. And I think my experience as Equal Opportunity Commissioner from my previous role in South Australia, I I worked with organisations like the SA Police and the Metropolitan Fire Service, very male-dominated organisations, you know, very similar to the construction sector in that, you know, cultures of entrenched male domination, the drive to bring more women in. But the problem, as Paula just said, was that unless you fix the culture, they don't stay, because, you know, in policing, the sense was that you come in, you have to behave like the men, you have to fit into that culture. The culture's not going to change. You either change to fit in it or otherwise you leave. And a lot of women leave because of that. And so the review that I did was about changing that. We made 38 recommendations, and then we monitored the police to look at how they were implementing it. And at the end of the 3 years of monitoring, they'd implemented everything. They had got the groundwork had been done, but that culture shift was still going to take a long time, you know, to get that change through. And that's the sort of thing, the culture of sexualisation of women, sex discrimination, sexual harassment, and so forth. It requires sustained effort, really.
Yeah. Andre, if I can bring you in, you've just had a chance to listen to a range of perspectives there. I know that you and your business are keen to get more women involved in the construction sector. You've said that. What are the barriers as you see them, and what are you doing to try and overcome some of those barriers?
Yes, thanks, Paul. I concur with all of the previous notes in terms of culture. And the culture piece is, there is no doubt that there's some bias that exists within this industry. That is beyond any question. But it's how we all work through that and change that culture, because the industry is a really interesting industry, Paul, because you can't offshore a lot of the things we're talking about here. So it needs to be constructed here. Australia, by definition, is a very aspirational place to live. And I feel that that will continue. And I feel that the construction industry and the infrastructure industry is very well placed and is going to require enormous amounts of skills and people to participate, as we are finding now. We've got a skill shortage and into the future. So the opportunity is there. It's just about changing the culture and education. And the education cuts across so many levels. In fact, it cuts across every single level, not least within the industry, and trying to understand and make and percolate to everyone within the industry to actually acknowledge that there is a cultural endemic problem. And you can't then start to fix the culture until you've done that. But also, Paul, interestingly, within down all at every level of this issue of this situation, within the schools and the education, we talk about the STEM aspect, which is a very important aspect that you touched on earlier. But there's within this industry, and whether it be Paula or Nikki, there is so many different careers. Currently in our organisation, we've got accountants, lawyers, we've got marketing, we've got comms, we've got environmental roles, and we're not very good as an industry, I feel, in terms of really enunciating all of those aspects. Paula, she spoke earlier that she spent 5 years as a construction lawyer 20 years ago in the West Coast of America. We're not great at doing that, and it doesn't just have to be STEM, but yes, that's an aspect to talk about, but it's at all of those levels. But I do remain really optimistic, because the opportunities are there, and the want is there, and there's some great incentive, because the most important thing is the need is there, Paul.
And also, is there a recognition on the part of industry and on the part of people like yourself that the industry would be improved by having more women, that women bring to the industry, dare I say, different ways of approaching these things, different skills? Perhaps they're better on the relationship side of things. And construction, as you know, a lot of construction, which is an incredibly expensive business, is about relationship building and so on. Do you see a clear benefit for both your company and the industry on the whole in getting more women involved?
Well, absolutely, I do. I have one of my strongest business cultures that I hold on to very, very highly is diversity. And whether that be skill set diversity, whether that be geographic diversity, but we're also talking about gender diversity. And by having diversity, you have diversity of opinion, and that drives a stronger culture within a business, and it drives a better business. Do I see that within our business? Absolutely. Do I see that in the wider construction industry? I do see it, and I do see a want, but I also, there is an unconscious aspect that we're on this journey, and we do need to ensure that this, because our industry is a great industry, and the legacies we leave, they're there, whether it be a building or a bridge or anything in between. What we're not great at is enunciating all of those aspects of the industry, and we can be better at that. And I feel that can really highlight to other industries and schools and the wider populace the opportunities that do exist within this industry, and that will help to, it will naturally work that way, because that blokey culture that has been prevalent and is still prevalent, Paul, in pockets, is not a good aspect of our
industry. I'd like to talk, Christine, a bit more about the culture. That term's come up a lot in this discussion. On the one hand, I suppose the culture is big burly blokes on building sites that don't have female toilets or female showers. I mean, we can kind of get our head around how that is a very female unfriendly workplace. But do you think the culture is even more deeply rooted than that? And can you, I've heard, for example, this is a hard drinking culture. This is a hard working culture. I mean, 10, 11, 12-hour days are not uncommon. Can you talk to the culture and how the culture needs to change to be more friendly to women?
Look, absolutely. I think that the one word, if I could sum up what I think the culture of the industry is, it's rigid. Like, it's immovable. We've been doing this for 300 years. This is how we do it, because this is what is required of us in order to actually get the job done. And this is where I really believe that the government, particularly as a government as a client, has a lot to do in this space. But the rigidity of the workforce, it's that presenteeism. It's that must sit here until the boss goes home. And the only way I can be seen to be doing a job is if I'm sitting at my desk and working all those hours. And those sorts of hours are just absolutely not sustainable. But they're also absolutely impractical if you're talking about having to accommodate carers. And the problem is, and COVID has been the big realisation of this, is that women are still, quite frankly, the primary carers. Now, there is a gradual move away from that. And, I'm really enjoyed seeing a lot of articles on LinkedIn where men are coming out saying, thanks so much to my company who's allowed me to have parental leave because it's allowed me to do the thing. More stories about that, please, because I think that is where you do have these culturally ingrained roles. Women are the carers. Women are the ones who are going to do the whole homeschooling throughout COVID. So we can't work the same sort of hours. So we need to bunny off at 5 because we need to collect the kids from daycare. Or if it's not kids, it's, we've got elderly parents or some other caring duties. It tends to, that caring side of what women bring to a workforce is also one of our biggest disadvantages, which is why there's that pay gap. It's that rigidity that needs to be broken down. So if we're looking at how to actually fix this and fix the culture, we need to smash down some of this rigidity. And if COVID's taught us nothing, then the ability to have flexible workplaces has got to be the thing. I mean, that is the silver bullet, the only silver bullet that COVID's bringing. And that is, it is possible to actually run a flexible workplace. You do not need to be sitting in an office for 13-hour days in order to actually get the job done. You can do it part-time. You can do it in a way, or in a job sharing way, and you can do it from home if necessary. So I think so that blokey part, that really does go back to, and I think Paula said it, going back to the 1950s. I think you're right. I think the Australian construction culture is still so steeped in that very, very old mindset. And when I read about your experience in America, I have to say I was a bit gobsmacked. So I always think of them as being a bit backward, but there you go. I've learned something because I think that mindset or that culture from that, well, man equals breadwinner, man's job is, the trade or the construction, therefore man must stay and do all the things. That is 1955. And, we need to wake up, and the industry needs to wake up and realise. And when I say the industry, it's the leaders of the industry that need to actually filter that down, because when you look at, how many women in those leadership roles, that's where the percentage is really small. Who's making decisions? Who's setting the culture? Who's setting that, the aspirations for the organisation? Is the leadership. And if you don't have enough women up there filtering that down, then that culture is never going to change.
And the other problem, Paula, and we saw this on the television program Misrepresented recently, which looked at women in politics where they are still in minority. If you're a woman in a male-dominated industry, it is very, very hard, even if you're extremely competent and extremely hardworking. So it's a chicken and egg situation, isn't it? You can get more women in, but do they stay when it's male-dominated?
Well, I don't share Andre's optimism, I'm afraid. I think I was optimistic 25 years ago when I set up Nawic that it would change just by just chipping away, increasing the number of women coming in, making it a more women-friendly workplace, and it hasn't happened. And I think the time for talking is over, and we need to actually take, pardon the pun, but concrete steps. We need to smash down the concrete walls that are keeping women out of the industry. And one of the things we need to do is to get a critical mass of women, because the culture is not going to change when we've just got a few tokenistic women who are coming in, one or two tradies on a site.
And do we need to mandate that, do we?
Well, we have a Local Jobs First Act in Victoria that's been in place since 2003 that says we are going to prioritise government jobs, government projects have to prioritise local businesses. Why can't we translate that into women as well? Why can't we say on government projects, you are going to have to demonstrate that you have women not in tokenistic positions, not an isolated number. The research in Norway says that 40% is a critical mass. When you get 40% of women, that changes the culture. So Nawic's now saying, 25% by 2025. I'd like to say 40% by 2040, because I think we need to aim higher. And I think we do need to start talking about mandates, about quotas. We talk about internal and external factors that influence us. And so the internal factors, the intrinsic are, it's the right thing to do. And therefore we should be doing it. And the right thing to do is to have gender equality, is to get rid of the gender pay gap. But that's obviously not motivating people enough to change. So I think we need the extrinsic motivating factors, which is, here are the rules, now comply with them.
Yeah, I will come to Nikki in a minute. Just one more question, though, to you, Paula. Is part of the problem, too, that we don't see the representation of women in an industry like this? So if women don't see, or girls don't see themselves in an industry, if they don't see themselves depicted in an industry or even imagine it, then it's hard for them to even take that step of planning to go into an industry like that.
Absolutely. There's loads of research that tells us that children don't aspire to positions where they don't see themselves already there. So Julia Gillard as Prime Minister will have made that dream of going into politics a possibility for a number of girls. Seeing Indigenous football players creates a momentum for others, Indigenous kids, to aspire to that. So we do need senior women in construction, and to be very visible in order to make that a possibility.
Yeah. So Nikki, I was interested in one of the things that you do on the commission is that you insist that the public sector, and by that we're talking about public servants, councils, universities, and so on, undertake gender impact assessments on the programs and services that they develop. And it seems to me that what that is doing is forcing organisations to think about gender and to think about how accommodating they are to diversity. Is that something that we could look to introduce in the construction sector?
I think so. I think there's all sorts of initiatives around that. Yeah. So gender impact assessments required under the Gender Equality Act, so that for every program, policy or service that an organisation develops or is intending to deliver, they must put a gender lens over it if it has a direct and significant impact on the public. So that's one way that the Gender Equality Act is going beyond the public sector and influencing gender outcomes in the community. But there are some other levers under the Act as well. So the Act, also says that the Minister can develop guidelines for procurement. Government procurement, and that's a big area. I think that one of the most powerful tools that that governments have got to accelerate gender inclusive economic growth. And each year governments spend billions of dollars on procurement. It actually accounts for about 1/5 of global domestic product. And in fact, in Victoria alone, in 2018-19, the government spent around 18 billion on goods and services and around 13 billion on public construction. Public construction and infrastructure. So when you think about it, if the government wants to influence change in an industry, and it's doing, Victoria's got a Women in Construction initiative, which has lots of things that will drive change, but they will take time. And a lot of stakeholders have said to me, some parts of the industry just won't change until they're forced. And so government procurement is a way of kind of really driving that change more rapidly. And we've got there's not a huge amount of great research on this, I would have to say. There's a lot of initiatives around the world and a lot of private sector organisations actually working in doing procurement, social outcome procurement, but not a lot of outcomes research yet. But it is, when you think about it, it's a major lever that governments have, I think, in driving change in the sector.
You mentioned earlier that you did some work in South Australia with the fire service and I think the police.
Yeah.
How do organisations like that respond to somebody like you coming in, having a look at what may well be described as a male-dominated culture, a culture where harassment and sexism occurs, and, in a sense, demanding that things change? Are men in power, I suppose is the question I'm asking, conducive and open to the kind of recommendations that you put forward?
Well, I would say it depends who you ask in the organisation. So in both those cases, I was invited by the leaders of those organisations to come and do an independent review. But I would say when I started, their view wasn't necessarily the view of everyone in those organisations, and there was a lot of resistance, at all levels throughout the organisation. A lot of women were incredibly excited that we were in there doing it, but some women were just like, I don't even want to talk to you. I've gotten here the hard way. I've done the hard yards and played the tough game, and you're about weakening all of that. So women weren't necessarily our allies in that either, for understandable reasons. But I would say that's why I said about culture change needing a lot of time. You put everything in place and then to set it up for change, and then you need to keep at it. It is a long game. And that's why one silver bullet doesn't work. You've got to have things happening in all different sorts of levers, government, industry, it's got to be leadership, it's got to be owned, and there's got to be consequences, I think, for not doing it, like you don't get government business, like you don't get to work on this particular site or whatever unless you play the game. We've done it with work health and safety. We should be able, that's driven real change in construction and in all sorts of industries. When you start thinking about, sexual harassment and sex discrimination, I think they're work health and safety issues. So they should be, it should be the bottom line that doesn't exist on building sites, just like you can't jeopardise workers' health and safety in other ways. Those are the sorts of things I think we need to be doing, right across the industry.
Yeah. I know, Andre, that you have employed a diversity manager in your office to address some of these issues, but I was particularly interested actually in the project that you won with Loretto's Girls' School in Toorak, 50% of the workforce on that project, I understand, were women. Crane drivers, plant operators, supervisors, 50% women. And I understand that that project finished ahead of time, ahead of schedule, ahead of budget. Tell us about that and what we are to glean from that example.
Well, it's a very unusual project for us to finish ahead of time and ahead of budget, Paul. So that was by itself an excellent outcome. But yes, it's an all-girls school in metropolitan Melbourne that we completed maybe about 12 months ago, and we set ourselves a very opportunistic target and said, why not? And because we were in control and the discussion, we had a lot of discussion internally, and in the end, it just came down to let's have a go, and we did. And to the credit of the entire workforce, to the credit of the client, to the credit of everyone, it was achieved with 52% female participation. And it wasn't in the roles that just gave lip service in terms of potentially, and I'm not trying to demean these roles, because every role on a construction within a sector I believe is equally as important as others, but some could consider, there's a large percentage of female traffic controllers as an example, but we really wanted to break the paradigm, not for any other reason than to prove to ourselves that this could be done. And we did, and we're able to achieve this very successful project, which happened to be at an all-girls school. Unfortunately, right at the start of the project, which was at the commencement of March last year, we had arranged for the STEM division within the girls' school to come in and have weekly toolbox meetings with our crew, and we'd work through them. It was a design and construct job, the entire process, but unfortunately COVID took care of that and school ceased in Melbourne. So we weren't able to leverage off that. But yeah, so we were able to prove and dispel to ourselves that was possible, and it was indeed very successful. So these things are occurring, and yes, it is incredibly difficult, and yes, I agree with all the comments about mandating thresholds and things like that. And that is.
So you are comfortable with that idea of governments perhaps deciding that, look, we've had enough of this. If you don't get your Gender Equity Act together, you're not going to be able to bid for these contracts.
I'm not only comfortable, but maybe to just be very clear, this is not unusual, Paul. Every contract we sign with any jurisdiction around Australasia, there are thresholds there for Aboriginal participation or local participation, for skill set participation. At the moment, we're doing a job at Shepparton Rail Corridor, and we've agreed to a very ambitious threshold of bringing disenfranchised youth and from correctional facilities back in, and it's a significant threshold. So these thresholds are in place and mandated, and I agree with every panelist. It should be, and that's another way, but it's not the only way, but it's another way to ensure that we can address what is a cultural issue.
Christine, how important is it to have the unions on side if you want to drive the cultural change in the construction sector? I mean, there would be some people, doubtless, who would argue that it's the unions who've helped maintain the boys' club. So if you want to drive change, presumably they need to be a part of this conversation.
I think it's unavoidable, and it may also depend on where you are. But like in the ACT, for example, the local union has won a grant from the ACT government to actually look into how it is that they can support more women on construction sites. Now, I'm absolutely champing at the bit to talk to them and say, great, how can we help? Because I'm curious as to know how that's going to work. But what we're hearing is that there is a willingness to do so and to support women. I suppose what concerns me is that, look, Nawic's been around for 25 years. We like to call ourselves the peak body for women in construction because we're 25 years old. We've got to have some sort of, cred as a result.
Yep.
So I'd like to think that, that consultation will be done with us, because whilst there are, yes, they are dealing with their members, our membership also extends across the country and is quite extensive. And the stories that I'm hearing are that the message isn't getting through. And I think this is the issue, and specifically when it comes to things like targets. So, and again, I mean, the ACT is a jurisdiction I know quite well. So, and you're right, we have similar sorts of targets and mandates. I don't think they're high enough. But the complaint I've had from industry, having talked with them excessively, is they all want to do the right thing. But I think after the whole Me Too movement came through, the then president of the NBA at the time said, yeah, look, our guys, they want to do the right thing. They're just really scared about how they go about doing it. And so that education piece we're talking about, that is where the unions can get involved. That education piece is super important, because really, respect for women, it's not rocket science. Maybe it is a little bit in the industry, because there still needs to be that education component. And that's part of our strategic plan. We are literally talking about education from, let's get into primary schools, high schools, and let's just teach girls about what a career in construction looks like, because it is vast. But then the education from the other way around, we have to educate industry. We have to educate industry about what it is, what they need to do to actually retain the women, because retention is huge. Because a lot of the feedback we got was, look, these targets are great and government can mandate all the things, but how the hell are we meant to keep up? Where's the pipe? There is no pipeline. And it is that bit of a circular argument to go, well, why do you think that is? Why do you think there are fewer and fewer, young girls putting up their hand to get into engineering? Because they all do. They start and then they sidestep into something else because they look at the industry and go, no thanks.
We've got a couple of questions that have come in just on that issue, actually. I might fold both of these into one and get some responses from you. Melanie has asked, do you have any tips for girls and young women who are seeking an apprenticeship in the industry? What can they do to both look after themselves and get a good start on their career? And related to that is from Sue, awareness and a culture shift needs to start in universities. My daughter was one of 2 female students studying civil engineering. She was continuously exposed to remarks, comments from lecturers and peers, often told she would find a job easily as she was female, and companies wanted to boost the diversity numbers up. So I think very much hinting there at kind of condescension because she was a woman. Perhaps, Christine, would you like to comment on that? And I might get a comment from Paula as well afterwards.
I think in relation to the apprenticeship question, that is exactly what Nawic is targeting right now. And that is, trying to look at pathway programs from, girls who are entering from high school into an apprenticeship. But what Nawic does is insert itself into that process and mentors and shadows those young women, but also helps set them up with companies who are either our members or our stakeholders, that we know that if they're going to be a member of Nawic, they ascribe to our values and our beliefs and our mission. But I think, and having that ability to reach out to women who've either been through it or who understand what it's like to be potentially the only woman in that area, in that job, that is fundamental. Having that support, because whilst a lot of the larger companies might have the understanding, the vision, what we're finding is that trickle down at that subcontractor level, there seems to be this middle ground. The much smaller organisations, like mum and dad companies, they have daughters, they get it. It's shocking to think that that's the reason why they get it, but it is. So it seems to be that middle ground where you've got a lot of companies who are, look, they're there to try to make a buck. They're not there to sort of try to make the facilities or make the work environment palatable for women. They've got a job to do. That's where the education piece needs to be, and it's also where the support needs to be. So the advice there is, find an organisation like Nawic or Tradeswomen Australia or SALT or many of the other organisations who are supporting women in trades, and they will help you through that and they will guide you through that. What I say in relation to that whole concept of the university and that the business about, you'll get a job because you're a woman. There's a couple of different ways of looking at that. And when UTS brought out they lowered the ATAR for women who want to get engineering, and there were 2 schools of thought about that. On one hand, the absolute outrage, how dare they? On the other hand, don't care. If I get in and once I get in and I can then make my mark, I don't care how I get in as long as I'm in. So really are 2 schools. I mean, I think, look, it's really quite disappointing to hear that that's happening at university level, because you think that should be the education institution where you go to be a little bit more enlightened. That is out there. That is the discrimination that is front and center, and women are dealing with that every single time. The only reason you're here is because somebody had to tick a box.
Yeah.
And my response is, what do you care? You're there, just get the job done and show that you can do it.
Paula?
Look, there's a lot of research about this. And I remember when I set up Nawic in Australia, talking to Helen Tippett, who was the first professor of architecture in Australia. And one of her big regrets was she actually always wanted to be an engineer. And the university, Melbourne University, said, if you can find another female to enrol with you in engineering, we'll take you, but we won't take just one woman because it'll be too hard. And she couldn't find another a female to enrol in engineering with her, so she went to have a very successful career in architecture. It emphasises and highlights the need for critical mass, the need for the numbers. And yes, there are people who will resist quotas or affirmative action and say that, you know, people aren't getting in on their merit. But again, we don't have to reinvent the wheel. Other countries have been doing this. And the research shows that, yes, initially there's resistance to change. It's unfamiliar. They're uncomfortable with it. But you know what? Being uncomfortable is okay. Change is hard. And it's a price we have to pay for the benefits that we're going to receive. So I am all for having programs to get more women in so that there is a critical mass, and making sure that within engineering and the other STEM units that you've got female academics there as well. So that the students can see that there are women who achieve seniority in these careers.
I hear that you have taught at university dispute avoidance management in construction. So I ask you this question: would we see fewer disputes if there were more women in the industry?
The evidence is clear. 100%, absolutely. There is $7 billion a year wasted on construction disputes in Australia, a year. And the research has been done about what leads to those disputes. And it's the adversarial, confrontational way that construction is conducted. And Martin Loosemore and Natalie Galea have done the research that says, actually, if you put more women on construction sites, it changes things. The communication changes, the cooperation, the collaboration increases. So when Andre talks about the Loreto School finishing within budget and within time, it's not coincidental that that happened when you had so many women on site, because the amount of negative conflict reduces. And if I can just share one quick story with you that a professor from the psychology faculty shared with my students in a construction class years ago. She was engaged to look at why there were so many fights breaking out at the nightclubs on King Street in Melbourne in the early hours of the morning. And so she went down there, this psychology professor, to observe what was going on. And then she filed her report with the nightclub industry, and said, you need to engage female bouncers. At the moment, you are engaging the biggest beefed up men that you can find, and they're filled with testosterone, and their clients at the nightclub are filled with testosterone and alcohol, and surprise, surprise, fights break out. If you actually have women bouncers, they will be able to manage removing drunk patrons without it resulting in violence.
Yeah.
That's a lesson that the construction industry could learn from as well.
I mean, to understand gender equity, Nikki, is to understand how deeply ingrained culture and, sexism, basically unconscious often sexism is. Like, just one example, presumably tools that are used on construction sites are not designed with women in mind. Women have, for example, to use a very basic example, smaller hands than men. If tools are designed for men, they're going to be harder for women to use. If they're harder for women to use, they don't feel at home on a construction site. They're picked on by the men because they can't use them. That's a small example, but it goes to the heart of this discussion, doesn't it?
Yeah. There's a brilliant book called Invisible Woman by Caroline Criado Perez that just documents the ways that the whole world has been designed around the sort of standard man as the default male, as she describes it. And you know, and she raises like the size of cement bags. Why are they that size? They're that size because they were designed by men for men. Bricks that fit beautifully into most men's hands don't fit that well into women's hands. Why were they made that size? Because they fitted nicely into men's hands, and that's all that we had to think about back then when they were designing them. And, you know, there's just an entire world, you know, even gardening tools designed by men for men, where we've got more innovative businesses now designing tools around women's hands and women's strength. But also there's a lot of innovation that industry is driving around how women can use heavy equipment more safely. And it's not just safer for women and then more accessible by women, it's also better for men because they're less likely to risk injuring themselves. It's also better for older men in the industries and so forth. Again, you know, not having to risk their own health, safety and well-being. So a lot of the things that would change to help get women into a sector or into an industry would also help men. And the discussion that you were having before with Paula around the adversarial nature. I mean, most men don't benefit from having a really, you know, horrific fight during their workday. It creates stress, it creates mental ill health. And, you know, it's probably one of the reasons why there's such a high suicide rate in the industry. We have this stereotyped thinking about men and women from the moment children are born, or even while they're in utero. We start thinking about if we're having a girl or a boy and what kind of the way that we design their bedroom and the colours and so forth. So it's very much an ingrained part of how we think this sort of gender roles, and we've really got to break out of that right across, you know, everything that we do. But particularly this is kind of like, as we've been saying, one of those sort of last bastions, that this and mining and emergency services, I think, would be the sort of three kind of, you know, major areas where change needs to happen in that regard.
And also, even though it's a male-dominated industry, Andre, this doesn't mean it's good for men. I mean, a lot of the practices in the industry are very, like, just one example, if you're carrying around the concrete bags that Nikki was talking about for a lifetime on building sites, you're going to retire with a broken body. But even more seriously, perhaps than that, the high levels of adversarialism and stress that take place in a workplace really takes its toll on people mentally. Your industry, Andre, has got terrible rates of suicide. We heard earlier from Paula, and also it's recognised as one of those sectors where there's a very hard drinking and to some extent drug taking culture. How aware are employers like yourself of this, and what are you doing to try and rectify it?
Yes, it's a very good point. It has a perception and a reality, Paul, of being a very adversarial industry, and it does have some stereotypes which are real, and some of the aspects of the physical aspects you talk about are real, although technology is certainly removing a lot of that, so they're not as prevalent, and we need to be able to educate others about that. But in terms of the stress and the work-life balance, this industry is very ordinary. It is changing, and it has to change. And I think one of the aspects, and I think maybe Christine mentioned it earlier, there has been a couple of glimmers through this situation and the pandemic over the last 18 months that has really taught a lot of people, including myself, of how to do things differently. And we can have a better work-life balance. And the aspects that we're certainly working through in terms of flexibility, in terms of working, 4 days instead of 5, and things like that, which is starting to come to the fore. It's traditionally been a 6-day working week within this industry, and there's a whole lot of perceptions and aspects like that. But the 2 points, if I may, Paul, I talked about earlier, there is one actual aspect that I do like to dwell on, and it's in terms of industry and all of these changes. I think there's every point is very valid. But the market, in terms of business, from an overall point of being in a business, you have to address what the addressable market is at any point in time. It makes absolute no sense, and it is not sustainable as a business to continue to look at only 50% of society when you have a skill shortage. It is not sustainable. The pipeline over the next 30 years as Australia grows from 25 to 30 to 40 to 50 million, some of the projections, and in terms of the infrastructure that our cities and regions need, it does not make good, sustainable business sense, and the market will drive these decisions, albeit it needs all of these aspects we need to be doing now to actually propel that. But I remain cautiously optimistic that it will no longer be bias and things like that, because the market will dictate that you need. And that's, unfortunately, whether we like it or not, that's a lot of aspects. If you look back in history, how market has changed the dynamics of issues of such gravity as what we're dealing with now.
Yeah, well, there's a lot of money involved. So yes,
it is, and the opportunities are enormous, and it is indeed a great industry, despite all of those perceptions, which are true and alive and well, as they would be in most other industries, I'm sure. The second aspect,
sure, yep.
Pardon me. The second aspect that's occurred to me as we're talking is role models. In terms of changing culture, this industry lacks. It has a vacuum of female role models, we need to ensure that is and it's through processes like this and platforms such as Nawic. The irony that we're here talking about Nawic and not NAMIC, and there's not even an organisation called NAMIC, is not lost on me. How many industries actually need to have this? It is an indictment, but that role model piece is an important one.
Okay, I might just finish up on some questions. We haven't got a lot of time left. Lisa has written this question. I'll perhaps put it to you, Christine. A question about leadership. What I think we often find on major construction projects is that the most senior leaders, especially the delivery-oriented ones, can epitomise all of those rigid macho behaviours and expectations that put women off joining or staying in our industry. What can we do when that culture is driven from the top? How do we make the change and introduce consequences into that environment?
For me, it's really easy. More women in leadership roles, full stop. Now, that sounds really simple because it should be. And that comes down to when I'm talking about the gender pay gap, that gender pay gap is captured at that top end mostly, because that is where the money is. But it's where the decisions are made. I mean, you look at any of the boardrooms. I know that the AICD have just published recently how there's been a shift in number of women on boards and how it's gone up. And I would love to see a breakdown of what that is by industry, because I dare say that that's not quite true in the construction industry. Those leaders, and I'm talking about CEOs and the C-suite. So Andre, I'm looking at those leaders going, you need to ensure, like through programs like sponsorship programs, where you actually are attracting women into those positions, because that is where those decisions are being made. So I think in the short term, where it's going to take a little bit of time to get women into those leadership roles, I think it's actually interacting with organisations like Nawic and other like-minded organisations to say, well, and that's that education piece, what would you do differently? Because look, and a lot of the time the companies are looking at the bottom line, they've got shareholders and all that sort of stuff that they have to answer to. So it then goes to, okay, well, how are these projects procured? And if you've got the client, particularly government clients, saying, you know what, we are quite happy for you to deliver this over a 5-day working week instead of a 6-day working week. And we know that there are examples of that happening in New South Wales right now. And the research coming out is, and I know Natalie Glee is involved in that, is incredible, because, when you suddenly go, well, if the client's made the decision, yes, it may cost a little bit more money in the short term, but that it's worth it to us because we're going to have less, people taking their lives. If suddenly you've got that the leadership talking in space of our people are worthwhile, our people are valuable, yes, we're going to deliver a fantastic project because we have the okay from the client to do that. That is what's going to change, but that has to be done at that C-suite level, because it's not going to be done ground up. Ground up they'll just leave. The women will just leave. So you just won't have any. So that's where the change has to happen.
Got a question here that came through yesterday. Perhaps I'll put this one to you, Paula, not specifically about the construction industry, I should say. How do the panellists feel about the current government's response to the Respect at Work report, proceeding with only 6 of the 55 recommendations made, particularly in terms of how ready Australia is for cultural change and ensuring all women feel safe at work, not just the construction industry? That's a bigger picture question, but have you got a response to it, Paula?
I do. I think it's absolutely shameful. And I think the standard that we walk past is a standard that we tolerate. And if we're prepared to ignore the clear evidence that women are being harassed and discriminated and bullied and harmed in the workplace, then that sends, why should business do anything different? If the government is saying, oh no, you don't have an affirmative duty to prevent discrimination in your workplace, and no, it's okay to just quietly settle any claims of sexual harassment and just, sweep it under the rug with a non-disclosure agreement. We have to change. It's going to be uncomfortable. But unless we want our children, our sons and daughters growing up in the same culture and the same environment in 25 years' time, then we need to take action now. And we need to not tolerate this sort of behaviour. And I was involved on the construction project actually at the National Museum in Canberra, which was the first contract of an alliance model done in Australia on a building project. And alliancing is about cooperation and collaboration and to try and not do it in an adversarial way. And one of the parties had a real head kicker as their senior person on site. And the other party said, look, this isn't going to work if you keep him in this role. And so that company got rid of him and they brought in someone who was prepared to operate collaboratively and cooperatively. So if there are leaders on site who are not working in the best interests of everyone there, then their bosses need to move them on and get someone else in who will create a safe space.
One more question. I think it may almost have to be the last one. I'll put it to you, Nikki. Feel free, if you wish, to add to Paula's comments there about the Respect at Work report and the government's response to it. But another question here, it's not specifically relating to your job, but I think you can comment on it, from Christina. When young boys in school who don't want to pursue a university degree are encouraged to take up a trade and in turn become a part of one of the highest paying industries in Australia, young girls in the same position have traditionally been steered towards hairdressing and admin work. Do you believe enough is being done in schools to change this? What more can be done to change it? I mean, I suppose this is about change, isn't it?
Yeah, absolutely. I'll make a comment about Kate Jenkins' report, because I think when we have the woman who is with the most authority and expertise undertaking a comprehensive national study and making a report to government, and then we don't follow what she suggests, I don't know what else we need to drive change in that area, but it's incredibly disappointing, I would say. On that question, I don't think that we are doing enough. I think that's where the Gender Equality Act would potentially drive change in education will be to have our education sector look at its programs that it is delivering to our children and do so with a gender lens and think about what kind of biases they are reinforcing or even perpetrating throughout our education systems. We absolutely need change at every single level, at every single stage. And that's why, as I said before, no one silver bullet is going to drive this, but we do need really to be thinking about how we educate our children and the kind of stereotypes that we are continuing to perpetrate through our education system.
And is there something that you have learned throughout your career working in this area, some lesson that you have learned about how you go about truly changing the culture sufficiently to turn around an industry with such an ingrained level of dominance by men? I mean, is there one thing, or is there something that you can say that this is what they need to do?
I wish I could, Paul. What I will say is that I don't believe, we get resistance where we do try to create change in male-dominated industries. That resistance is actually about fear. And so we need to approach it as such. Men are not evil. They don't get up in the morning thinking, generally speaking, I'm just going to discriminate against women. I'm going to be evil. I think men can change their thinking and will change their thinking, but we have to approach it as if there's goodwill there. And we've already heard from panelists and Andre in particular about how there is goodwill. There's all sorts of levers that will drive that change, and we've got to use all of them.
Yeah. Do you think there is fear, Andre, on the part of men in your industry? I mean, I know you see some of this in society more generally, that a lot of the traditionally blue-collar jobs that have been diminished are male jobs, and a lot of the new jobs that are growing in the new economy have been seen as traditionally female jobs, in inverted commas. Do you suspect that there is some fear within the construction sector among some men?
It's an interesting question, Paul. Yes, I guess I suspect there would be an indirect answer. And if I think deeply about that question, I can recognise seeing that fear. But that, I guess, is in the context of we've seen some industries being changed over the last, certainly through my 30-year career, and with technology displacing it. And we're certainly seeing that today in the coal mining transitioning into the renewable energy sector, of which we're a part of. And I guess there is that resistance and that fear that does pervade and does exist. Yes.
Yeah. And Christine, maybe a final question to you. I did hear that is it the Australian Construction Association who changed their board structure to get more women involved, and what they ended up doing was, rather than getting rid of all of the blokes on the board, they just added a whole lot of additional women onto the board to make it appear as if the board was equitable. Have I got that right? And if so, what's your response to that, Christine?
Yeah, I have to say, and Nawic is a part of Australian Construction Industry Forum, and ACA is a member, and I have a lot of respect for what they're doing in the space in relation to the Culture Industry Task Force. I think that doubling the board members is problematic, because I think instead of going, well, yep, we've got a board of 10, but we're going to make it 20 so that we have equal representation. Okay, so if we're saying that women have equal representation as the men, but you've got 2 representatives from each company, so 1 male, 1 female, the pessimist and the cynic in me, unfortunately I'm a lawyer, I'm a cynic, is going to say, you know what's going to happen? Every time the bloke doesn't want to turn up to the meeting because it's a bit of a, the woman's going to turn up to the meeting because she's the female representative. Now, I know that's really super cynical, and maybe that is just maybe it's more heads are better than one. I would much rather keep the board at 10, but have 50-50. Have a company say that woman there, she represents us.
Yeah, that requires some hard decisions, though, doesn't it?
It does, but that is what we need to do. We actually need to be a lot braver about this, and that's what I'm not seeing. I just want to see a bit of bravery. Going, yep, I have absolute 100% confidence that person I have put on the board has a company's full support, because they are the best person for the job. Full stop.
And if I can add some.
Please.
Sure, Paula. Yes, Paula.
Look, I was just going to add something in that how we frame this, the language that we use, is really important. So again, there's lots of research that's been done about this. And if you say we're introducing this mandate of 50% of the board because women are underrepresented, that'll be negatively received. If you say we're doing this because historically there's been discrimination that we're trying now to repair, then that will be more positively received. So the language that you use and how the problem is framed will have an impact on how it's received.
Okay, look, that's been a terrific chat. I'm going to have to wrap it there. I want to thank the panel who've been fantastic: Christine, Andre, Paula, and Nikki. Thanks to the audience who've been watching this at home and in the office, perhaps on Zoom. And thanks also very much to Marianne Waldron for all of her help. Right now, I'm going to hand back actually to Marianne, if she is there. And Marianne's going to help bring today's proceedings to a close. Over to you, Marianne.
Oh, thank you very much, Paul, and thank you for the panel. It was fantastic. But really, my job is finished as the producer. It's really up to Christine, who's the chair of the National Association for Women in Construction, who I feel really needs to end today's proceedings.
Thank you, Marianne. And look, thank you, everyone. I was very excited about bringing this panel together, and it's been a long time coming. But for me, and what I've been talking about for a very long time, is this is just the beginning. It's taken a long time to get to this point. And I mean, COVID has had its input here. But for me, what's really important is that I've attended a lot of forums, a lot of summits over the years where we talk about what the problem is. For me, it's actually coming up with a solution, and that is what Nawic is all about. And you know, Paula, when you started this organisation in Australia, you set it on its path. I'm just sorry it's taken 25 years to get to this point, but I think it's based on the comments I've seen coming through in the chat and the questions, and I hope we actually get a chance to answer some of these offline. I think there is definitely an appetite to continue the discussion, which is what we want to keep doing. I want to do these forums regularly. We may not always get you, Paul, but I want to keep doing this regularly because I actually want to know the answers, and having input from companies like Athiona, Andre, is actually super important because you know, you're one of the stakeholders who are going to be benefiting from having 50% women in your industry eventually. So the discussion needs to keep happening. The momentum needs to be maintained. What we're hoping through our membership is just that we actually do get the input from the stakeholders, because we want the questions to be asked, and the difficult questions we want answered. Because when somebody comes to me and says, look, I want to do the right thing, but I don't think I can gear up and you know, support, you know, having 50% quota for women because the pipeline's not there. What I want to be able to do is say, well, we can create the pipeline. Here is the answer. Or if I can't retain women, what's the problem? Here is the answer. And these conversations are doing just that. So I want to thank everybody for your input and for agreeing to be part of this forum. And let's keep it going. I want to keep going next year and the year after. And then hopefully, Paula, like you said, we won't need to exist anymore.
Thanks, Christine. Thank you, everyone. That was great.
Thank you.
Thanks very much. That was terrific.
Thank
All
you.
right. Thank you, everyone.
Thank you.
Thanks, Marianne.
Thank you. Bye-bye.